some of you might have heard this before. I did present this on the away day. So we're talking about fetal heart rate control. It makes sense when we're talking about CTGs because that's what we're discussing all the time. That if we are monitoring the heart, we at least know what actually changes the baby's heart rate. So fetal heart starts beating at around 4 weeks, or at least that's what we can detect on scan. It probably starts beating before that, but we can't pick it up on scan. This is on a transvaginal ultrasound scan, maximum zoom. Yeah. Now it has to continue beating forever, otherwise we die. Yes? Makes sense? We can live without a brain. We can't live without a heart. Now, the heart being very different from anything else, it has its own intrinsic heart rate. When it starts beating, it usually starts beating around 120 beats per minute. The range is usually between 110 and 140. That's usually where the heart beats. So if you take a heart out of the body, leave it on a desk outside, it will beat on its own at a rate of 120 beats per minute. Okay. Now then, as the body matures and the brain matures, then the heart rate starts becoming modified by two parts of the nervous system. The somatic nervous system, the part that controls our movement, our emotions, our sensations, and the autonomic nervous system. So sympathetic, parasympathetic. The part that controls the involuntary part of our nervous system. Yes? Why would the somatic nervous system change the heart rate? Any ideas? Ellen and Elsa, you're the two who are actually sitting in front of me. So unfortunately, most of the questions are going to be directed towards you until I start picking on the other guys. Why would the somatic nervous system bother about the heart rate? So if you're getting stressed, that's not necessarily part of the somatic nervous system, that is part of the sympathetic. But if you're doing an activity, so if you start going running, for instance, then it makes sense that your heart beats a little bit faster to provide oxygen to the muscles that you are using. If I start touching you, okay, then you might need some more blood, A, to figure out what's happening there, and B, to try and move away from that source of stimulus if you need to. Does that make sense? So the somatic nervous system is triggered simply by just to provide oxygen to whatever active organ is happening. And the way that looks on the trace is what we commonly use or describe as an acceleration. Yeah? So it also happens if the baby starts moving, okay? And that is what we're looking for if we're doing fetal scalp stimulation. So if I poke the baby's head, I'm looking to see that it has that acceleration. That means that its somatic nervous system is happy and working, okay? Now, what we're gonna discuss in more depth is the autonomic nervous system, okay? This is what controls the involuntary functions of the body. When we start off, the heart rate we said starts at 120. The sympathetic nervous system increases the heart rate. Yes? Makes the heart beat a little bit faster. While the parasympathetic reduces the heart rate. And the balance in between is where the baseline is. Okay? They're constantly interacting, and the agreement, as we said, is the baseline. And the interaction within them, the fluctuations within both, is what then gives the variability. Okay. Does that make sense? Okay. Obviously, we all know that the brain matures further and further, so the best is when the sympathetic and parasympathetic are both mature after 34 weeks. Before that, there's a process of development. The sympathetic starts developing first. So this is a baseline of about 130. This is just a diagram. As the sympathetic develops, because it develops first, starting from around 24, 26 weeks, it starts developing, reaching maturation probably around 28, 32 is where the sympathetic usually matures. So the baseline is going to start going up. Okay. As the parasympathetic starts developing, the baseline will start coming back down. And it will continue to go down for the rest of our life. So somebody who is 90 years old usually has a slower heart rate than somebody who's 60, who has a slower heart rate than somebody who's 30. Does that make sense? Okay. The sympathetic and parasympathetic work with something called, there's a difference between tone and responses. And that's something that we actually have to keep in mind very, very closely. There is something called the sympathetic response or a parasympathetic response, and there's something called the sympathetic tone. Tone means that everything has changed towards the sympathetic or the parasympathetic. So say I have a higher sympathetic tone, that means that the baseline has gone up, but a sympathetic response is going to cause just an increase in heart rate. Does that make any sense? Not really. So tone is something that is long lasting. Okay, you end up with a higher baseline. That's because you have a higher sympathetic tone. If you have a higher parasympathetic tone, that will end up with a lower baseline. Okay. When we're talking about the sympathetic parasympathetic, they work on the system by certain receptors. That's what triggers the responses, not the tone. Does that make any sense? So when we talk about receptors, we're always talking about sympathetic or autonomic responses. So when we're describing the baroreceptors and the chemoreceptors, those trigger the responses from the sympathetic and parasympathetic, not the tone. Okay. Talking about the receptors, what are baroreceptors? So baroreceptors are located within the ventricles, the atria, the aortic arch, and the carotid sinuses. Okay. The ones in the ventricles are supplied just by the sympathetic, not by the parasympathetic. The ones in the atria, aortic arch, and carotid sinuses are supplied by the parasympathetic. The chemoreceptors, on the other hand, are present mainly outside the heart, so the aortic arch, the carotid body again, and the brain, and they're all supplied by the parasympathetic. Okay? What are baroreceptors? Why do we have them, and what's the whole point of having them there? So baroreceptors are stretch receptors that are present within the wall of the blood vessels. They measure pressure changes. The ones in the ventricle, they are interested when the stretch of the ventricle is becoming less, which basically means that you are losing pressure, you're losing volume. Hence, the heart rate has to go up to maintain cardiac output. So if they are less stretched, then you have more sympathetic response. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. While the ones in the atria, aortic arch, and the carotid body, they get stimulated when they get stretched. What that means is that the blood is not flowing properly, that there's an obstruction down the line somewhere. So there's obstruction down here, which basically means that the arch and the vessels are really stretched. Hence, the heart has to slow down to wait for the blood vessel to empty before it can pump again. If a bus comes that is completely full, you usually don't try and get on the bus. Sometimes we try and do. Some of us try and push and get there. Most people just wait for the next one. Yeah, true. Social distancing is an important thing. Yeah, but the blood vessels have to empty first before the heart can pump again. Because if it doesn't, what's going to happen? The blood vessels are going to pop. You're going to end up with hemorrhages, brain, and everywhere else. Okay? What do you think? How do you think this is going to work? The baroreceptors work best, or we usually see them when there's cord compression. Okay? So let's play this and see what it looks like. So we're going to start off with a baby that has a little bit later up on the start, but so a baby has a heart rate that's running at about 140. Okay, and as the uterus starts contracting, which blood vessel is gonna get squashed first? Which one do you think? The vein or the arteries? Okay, So can you see which direction the vein, so the vein is carrying the blood from, the oxygenated blood from the placenta to the baby, while the arteries are carrying the blood from the baby to the placenta, yeah? If the vein gets squashed, okay, what do you think is gonna happen to the blood flow? So the blood flow coming from the placenta is gonna stop, the blood flow going to the placenta is still running. Volume within the baby, what do you think? So it drops. Baby's literally bleeding out to the placenta. And what do you think is going to happen with that? So the heart rate is going to go up to maintain the cardiac output. Okay. And as the pressure goes further up, the artery gets squashed. And now what's going to happen? Why?
Because the blood volume in the baby is staying the same.
So the blood volume is staying the same, but why would that cause a deceleration? Yeah. So what exactly is happening? Why is it going to cause a deceleration? So if you remember from last time, we said that 40% of the cardiac output goes to the placenta. You have literally just blocked almost half the outflow of the baby's cardiac output. So the blood that's leaving the heart, half of it now can't go anywhere. It's literally just filling the aorta. Okay? Yeah. It doesn't want to reduce cardiac filling. It has to wait until the blood vessel is empty. So it wants to reduce the cardiac output, not the filling. The filling is already reduced. Remember, the vein was already blocked. So the cardiac filling was already reduced. It was not 100% anyway. That's why the heart was beating faster. But the problem is now that 40% of the output has now nowhere to go. So it literally has to wait until the rest of the body can accommodate that blood. And that's why it drops dramatically from, say, 140 to 60, because you have a large volume of blood that needs to go somewhere, and 40% of your output is blocked. So it has to accommodate it elsewhere. Does that make sense? That's why the heart rate is going to suddenly, so it drops massively. It's very quick, very fast. It's literally a switch, okay? And it's going to remain slow at the rate that allows for the blood to flow to the rest of the body while the arteries are blocked. Does that make sense? So the heart rate is going to stay slow until the arteries are open again. Once the arteries are open again and the blood is flowing to the placenta once again, you're going to end up with the low volume that you started off with. Remember, we didn't block the arteries with normal volume. We blocked the arteries when baby was already slightly hypovolemic. Okay, so let's put this in numbers. Baby has 315 mL of blood. Okay, you blocked off the vein, so the artery is passing about 12-15 mL of blood per beat. So baby's heart blood volume is dropping by 15 mL per beat. Okay, in a minute, that's actually quite a big drop, but it doesn't last for that long because shortly after the block of the vein, the arteries get blocked. So let's say we've dropped from 350 to 300. The heart rate, baby's heart rate has gone up to accommodate for that. But suddenly, 50% of the output is blocked in that blood vessel. It's closed off. So the heart rate has to slow down, making sure that the blood flows to the periphery of the baby. Okay? Okay, but once the artery is open again and the blood flow is normal, remember, we already started off with 300 mL of blood rather than 350. So the baby's heart rate is not going to go up to the normal. It's going to go up to the higher than. So that's why it shoots up again, above what the baseline initially was. Does that make sense? And once the vein is open again, everything goes back to equilibrium and it goes back to a baseline. Do we understand that? Is that confusing? Are you sure you understand that? Shall I start asking questions to make sure that you guys know it? Okay.
The artery gets compressed first.
No, the vein gets compressed first, which means that baby is losing blood to the placenta, not getting it back. So the baby's volume is decreasing, which is why baby's heart rate goes up. Once the arteries get blocked, the heart now is beating against a brick wall. It has to flow, this blood has to flow out of the way before it can beat again, which is why it stays slow as long as the umbilical artery is blocked. Okay? Once that blockage is gone, it starts flowing out again, okay, before the vein opens, which means that the heart rate is going to go up to above the baseline once again before it settles back to the baseline. The backup is not within the heart. The backup is within the aorta. Okay? Not within the heart. The heart is stronger than having a backlog in it. Okay, so it is going to beat. If it beats, it's going to empty the volume. It's that strong, which means that the weakest link has to give, which is the blood vessels outside. And obviously, brain and peripheral bleeding is not really an option that the baby would like to do. Yeah. Okay. Let's look at this scenario once again. So, baroreceptors in action one more time. So we're starting off with a normal baseline. The uterus is going to start contracting. What's going to get blocked first? The vein. So the blood is going to flow from the baby to the placenta, and baby's blood volume is going to drop. Yes? Which means that baby's heart rate is going to go up. Okay. So the contraction is getting stronger. Now, what do we expect? Which blood vessels will be getting blocked next? The artery. Okay, so what happens if the contraction now decides to actually fade away rather than to continue?
Acceleration.
You'll get, so the vein is going to get open and it's going to settle back. And it would look like an acceleration. Okay? That's very odd. Why did that happen? Why did this happen? That's a sympathetic response. Okay, that's a transient sympathetic response. Basically, you had a bit of a block of the vein. The blood volume dropped for a bit, but then it never reached the point that it actually blocked the arteries, which is why you never got the deceleration. The problem with this is not a big issue. The only problem with this is that people look at this and say, acceleration, yay. Okay? Now, baroreceptor changes usually last for a very short time. They usually last for about 60, potentially 90 seconds, because that's what the contractions usually last for. Okay? Generally, baroreceptors are not associated with a lot of oxygen loss. Remember, the baby is not getting oxygen from the placenta. That is a given fact. The fact that you can see the acceleration, the fact that the heart rate has gone up, that means that the vein is pretty much blocked. But the baby's system, remember we said yesterday, the venous system does contain some oxygen. So the blood that's coming back from the venous system has about 25% oxygen saturation. So you can still get some oxygen from that. Does that make sense? And the baby's oxygen store within its body can last for about 90 seconds. Once it's going beyond 90 seconds, then it is going to become hypoxic. Does that make any sense? So when we're looking at those accelerations, okay, or partial cord compressions, when we only compress the vein, remember the baby gets its oxygen from the vein. So even though those compressions are not significant from hypoxemia or hypoxia point of view, if they become recurrent or if they become very prolonged, it will lead to hypoxia. And that's the hope. That's why it's important to recognize the partial cord compressions. How do you recognize them? How do you differentiate those partial cord compressions from the regular, happy, somatic accelerations? So they come with contractions. Okay, they're always going to be timed pretty much around the contractions. And as the contraction gets stronger, the deceleration is going to just about start and then get better. So you start off with accelerations, and then they end up with becoming M's. And as they get even stronger, they get deeper, and they turn into the variable decelerations that we know. Okay, as I said, baroreceptor decelerations, partial cord compressions are not really important from a hypoxia point of view unless they're becoming too frequent. If the baby is not getting enough time to replace its oxygen stores, it will eventually become hypoxic. Does that make sense? Very important. Okay. Bioreceptors, okay? Any questions before we move on? Guys online, any questions? You either can't hear us or I'm a perfect teacher. I'm of course a perfect teacher.
Perfect.
Thanks, Adam. So, chemoreceptors. We said chemoreceptors are present within the aortic arch, the carotid body, and the brain. Why are they there? So, they detect loss of oxygen or increased carbon dioxide and increased acid. Now, unlike us, the heart has to get paid first before it does the work. Okay? So if you don't give oxygen to the heart, it will not beat. It will wait for you to get its full payment before it can actually beat. Okay? So if the oxygen supply or if the oxygen coming to the heart drops significantly, the heart will literally just stop until it gets the payment. And the brain knows that. So what the brain is trying to do is to make sure that the heart rate is enough to be equivalent to the pay that it's getting. So if you have less oxygen coming from the placenta, then rather than beating at 120 or 140 beats per minute, if the brain slows down the heart a little bit, so say 110, then you have enough oxygen to last you for the next coming minute or two. Okay? If the oxygen supply drops even further, you slow down the heart so that you don't actually reach the point when you're entirely stopping. Because the brain knows that if the heart stops, the brain dies. It can't do anything at that point. Okay? So if you're getting less oxygen, you are going to get slower heart rate, just to make sure that the heart is getting enough oxygen to keep it going. Okay. Now, the changes in oxygen saturation don't just suddenly happen. They take their time. Okay, it drops gradually. So when you get less oxygen from the placenta, the heart beats blood supply that has less oxygen. The brain senses that, slows down the heart because it's expecting what's coming next. Okay, remember the heart gets its pay first. So the first blood vessel that leaves the heart is the carotids. So the brain, whatever sensors it has, comes after the heart, and that's basically detecting what it's getting. So it's trying to calculate what the heart is getting first. Okay, and it mediates that via the vagus nerve, the parasympathetic. Okay. Let's look at this in action. So the next contraction, what's going to happen is that the cord is not going to get squashed at all. The placenta within itself has lakes that can last for about 90 seconds. So you have 90 seconds within the placenta and 90 seconds within the baby. Okay. Let's assume that this baby actually has very small placenta lakes. So once the contraction starts, the blood going to the placenta is going to stop, which means that now the baby is relying upon its placenta lakes. Okay, so it's getting oxygen from the placenta. And as the contraction keeps on going, there is no blood coming to the placenta. Now, but the blood flowing from the baby to the placenta and back is ongoing. That's continuous. So it's basically taking oxygen out of the placenta. The placenta level within the oxygen level within the placenta is dropping, and it drops gradually. It doesn't just suddenly drop, it drops gradually. And as the brain senses that the oxygen supply is dropping, it starts dropping the heart rate. So it takes time for the contraction to start and the blood flow to the placenta to stop. And then the oxygen saturation within the placenta lakes to drop before the heart rate starts dropping. That's why it comes a lot later than the beginning of a contraction. Okay? And as it goes, as the contraction is ongoing, the heart rate is going to keep on dropping further and further. It's going to keep on going down. Okay? Now, once the contraction stops, the blood is going to get restored to the placenta. It's going to take time to restore the oxygen within the lakes. And after that's restored, only after the oxygen is restored, that the heart rate starts picking back up again. So it takes a lot longer for the heart rate to come back up. So it's a gradual drop, usually starts after the beginning of the contraction, way after, okay? And then it lasts for as long as the contraction is there and a little bit more until the oxygen stores start refreshing, and then it only starts picking up again. And once again, it's gradual rise. It's not a sudden rise. Does that make sense? That tells you that the placental lakes are running out. If we look at the next contraction, so this lady has now a contraction that's lasting here for about 3 minutes. Remember, there's less oxygen going to the baby. Yes? Okay. What's baby doing? It's now using its anaerobic metabolism. So once the contraction is gone and the oxygen stores is restored, it now needs to wash out the acid that built up during the contraction. And you end up with more blood going to where the acid was collected to clear out the acid, because acid is damaging within itself. So you end up with a slight rise in baseline, or a compensatory rise in baseline, which we call an overshoot. And that lasts for as long as there is still acid within the system. So frequently you see us, okay, well, I don't know whether there is a loss of contact, this is loss of contact, or is that a genuine deceleration? And, oh, I was here, I could hear it, and everybody's saying I could hear it. And once we actually put it there, we find that the baseline is now gone up to by 20, 30 beats. No, this was a deceleration. This was not loss of contact. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. So there are many things that can change the heart rate. We're not going to focus on those. We're focusing on the main things. Okay. Out of this entire mess, if you actually try, you can narrow this down to 3 and 3. So the only thing that increases the heart rate is the sympathetic nervous system. That's what's supposed to increase it, and the somatic. But what I'm talking about here is the tone. The somatic causes responses. It does not cause an increase in tone. So sympathetic nervous system, you can increase the tone of the sympathetic. You have a sympathetic that's firing at a higher rate continuously. Okay? Or you can give a chemical that stimulates the sympathetic receptors, which are catecholamines, like terbutaline, like adrenaline, like ephedrine. Yeah? They increase the tone. You have an increased tone for a while. And finally, arrhythmias. If we ignore arrhythmias, okay, because yes, they happen, let's ignore that. We're not beyond our discussion at the moment. The main things that increase your tone are the sympathetic and the catecholamines. The main things that reduce the tone is the parasympathetic, and there is no chemical that you can give to mimic the parasympathetic. Okay? You can give things that block the sympathetic, but you cannot mimic the parasympathetic by any medication or hormone. However, the heart can be slowed down directly by ischemia. If it does not get paid, it's not gonna beat. So it's gonna slow down because it's not being paid. Okay? The last thing that affects the heart rate, can increase it, can reduce it, and that's a very important point, is heat. If you heat up the heart, it beats faster. If you cool down the heart, it beats slower. That is a direct mechanical effect. So when you get a pyrexia, your heart rate increases. Okay? That's a direct mechanical effect. If you get cold, your heart rate decreases, it drops. Again, that is direct mechanical effect. Any questions? Shall we talk about the case? So that's the theory part.
What does it look like when you have 50 you get a cold compression and a is that the one that we see when it's put down?
Yeah. So if it's lasted for too long, it's going to take its time to refresh the stores again.